Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about a family that vanished in 1998 only for a mysterious rusted safe to be discovered in a swamp 27 years later that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the shadowed heart of Georgia's Okefenokee swamp, time does not truly pass. It coagulates. It festers. Here, beneath a sky choked with cypress and draped in the funereal shawls of Spanish moss, black water mirrors a world that has refused to change for millennia, for nearly 3 decades. This primordial realm held a secret in its cold, muddy embrace, a secret sealed in steel. Then, on a humid Tuesday morning in March of 2025, the modern world finally intruded. A geological survey team, contracted to map the swamp floor for a proposed conservation channel, brought their ground-penetrating radar and magnetometers into the suffocating humidity. Their instruments, designed to read the Earth's secrets, detected a stark anomaly, something unnaturally dense, something rectangular and man-made, buried deep in the peat and sediment. It was an object that had no place in this untamed world. Hours of methodical work followed. Chains were secured. A portable winch groaned under the strain, and the swamp reluctantly surrendered its prize. With a final, guttural shriek of metal parting from mud, it emerged into the dappled sunlight. A large gun safe. It was a rusted metal sarcophagus, its original green paint almost entirely consumed by a mottled skin of deep orange and brown. It looked like an artifact from a forgotten war, a relic that had been sleeping for a generation. But the swamp's acidic water, while relentless, had failed to erase a crude, almost violent carving on its heavy door, scratched into the corroding steel. Like a final, desperate scar on the skin of time were 2 initials and a date: DW 10-1598. For the seasoned investigators of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Unit, these markings were not just random graffiti, they were a resurrection. They were a ghost's whisper, a voice finally reaching across 27 years of absolute silence. A voice from a day that had begun not with the chill of a swamp's dark water, but with the warm, deceptive, and utterly heartbreaking glow of a perfect autumn morning. The morning of October 15th, 1998 arrived in Millbrook County, Georgia, with a gentle, crystalline clarity. It was the kind of day that artists try to capture on canvas and poets struggle to describe in verse. A day where the very air in the pine woods seemed to smell of nostalgia of wood smoke, distant bonfires, and the sweet, earthy decay of dying leaves. Sunlight, the color of pale honey, slanted through the canopy of ancient oaks and hickories that bordered the Witmore family property, painting a shifting mosaic of light and shadow on the well-tended lawn. Inside the modest ranch-style home, Sarah Witmore stood at her kitchen window. The warmth of a ceramic coffee mug seeped into her hands as she watched the scene unfold in her backyard. Her 8-year-old daughter, Emma, was a whirlwind of blonde hair and boundless joy, her laughter echoing in the crisp air as she chased their golden retriever, Buster in wide, gleeful circles around an old oak tree. The sight was a very definition of peace, a living portrait of the American dream, so perfect and so complete that it felt almost sacred. Sarah's thoughts were a gentle drift of domestic concerns: what to make for dinner, whether to suggest a trip to the lake that weekend, a mental note to pick up milk on her way home from her job at the county library. It was a world built on the sturdy foundations of love, routine, and the steady, predictable presence of her husband. David, his presence was a quiet constant, as reliable as the sunrise. But unbeknownst to her, it had already begun to recede. His essence was already fading into the encroaching shadows of a secret he had chosen to carry alone. The question that would soon detonate her reality and haunt an entire community for a generation had not yet even formed as a whisper in the back of her mind. How does a morning this perfect curdle into a nightmare without end? How does the story of a loving, ordinary family conclude with a rusted metal coffin, dragged from a swamp 60 miles from home? To understand how a man can simply vanish, one must first understand the world that allows for such disappearances. Millbrook County, in the late 1990s, was a place held in a delicate, almost tense, balance to the east. The urban sprawl of Atlanta was an ever-expanding leviathan, pushing new subdivisions and highways deeper into the countryside. To the west lay the timeless, untamed wilderness of the Georgia backcountry. Millbrook existed in the borderlands between these two worlds. On the surface, it was a postcard of Southern comfort, its town square, with a requisite Civil War memorial and a sleepy courthouse, was the county's heart. White steepled churches stood as sentinels of faith and community. And the local diner was the unofficial hub of governance, where gossip and political favors were traded over plates of grits and biscuits. It was a place where doors were often left unlocked and neighbors brought over casseroles in times of trouble. This intimacy, this belief that everyone knew everyone's business, fostered a powerful sense of security. But it was an illusion. This same intimacy also bred a culture of profound silence. Secrets, in a place like Millbrook, did not require steel vaults. They required only the unspoken social contract to not look too closely, to not ask questions that might disturb the carefully manicured peace. Skeletons were kept in closets, and everyone tacitly agreed not to open the doors. And surrounding this fragile pocket of civilization was a primordial entity, the vast Chattahoochee National Forest. It was more than just a collection of trees. It was a living, breathing labyrinth of winding trails, dense rhododendron thickets, and deep ravines where sunlight rarely touched the forest floor. It was a place where a man could walk a dozen yards off a marked path and be utterly, completely swallowed by a world that operated on older, more indifferent rules. The forest was a constant, looming presence, a green ocean that began at the edge of their backyards, further south. This wilderness bled into an even more formidable and ancient landscape, the Okefenokee Swamp, known to the indigenous Muskogee people as the land of the trembling earth. It was a sprawling, half-million-acre realm of black water, floating islands of peat, and impenetrable cypress stands. It was a place where alligators, ancient and unblinking, drifted like submerged logs. It was a place designed by nature to conceal, to absorb, to erase. It was the perfect place to dispose of a problem. This was the world that David Witmore inhabited, a community that hid its sins behind a veil of politeness, and a wilderness that hid everything else in plain. Terrifying sight. David Witmore was a man of routine. It was the bedrock of his character, the unwavering organizing principle of his life. His 5 years as a logistics specialist in the US Army had not just taught him discipline, they had forged it into the very fiber of his being. Every morning was an exercise in precision. Coffee was brewed by 6:30 a.m., its aroma a silent announcement of the day's start. The local paper was read, folded, and set aside by 7 in a row. His side of the bed was always made with immaculate, razor-sharp hospital corners, a habit that Sarah had long ago given up trying to tease him about. His punctuality was a quiet legend among his colleagues at the county water treatment facility. He was, by every conceivable measure, the solid, dependable, predictable center of the Witmore family's universe. For years, Sarah had found a deep and abiding comfort in his predictability. It wasn't boring. It was proof of his steadfastness, a daily reaffirmation of his unwavering devotion. Yet, in the final 6 months before he disappeared, almost imperceptible fissures had begun to appear in this foundation of routine. They were small, hairline cracks in the facade of the man she had married, subtle shifts in his quiet orbit that she had noticed but could not fully comprehend. It began with the unexpected installation of a state-of-the-art home security system. David, a man who had always scoffed at such things, claiming that greatest security was living in a town where everyone knew their name, suddenly became obsessed with its implementation. He oversaw the work himself, his posture rigid, his questions to the installers sharp and technical. He cited rising crime rates creeping out from Atlanta, but his eyes would often drift towards the dense, dark tree line at the edge of their property, as if the threat he truly perceived was not from the distant city, but from the silent, watching woods just beyond their lawn. Then came the new digital camera. In 1998, it was an expensive novelty. He claimed it was for capturing Emma's fleeting childhood, her soccer games, her birthday parties. But he handled it not like a treasured family keepsake, but with the grim gravity and secretive reverence a detective might afford a crucial piece of evidence. Sarah once found him in his home office long after midnight, the house still and dark. He wasn't editing photos of their smiling daughter. He was hunched over the camera, its cold, blue LCD screen illuminating his face, revealing an expression of such intense concentration and deep, gnawing anxiety that it startled her. He was clicking through images she couldn't see, his jaw tight, his breathing shallow. His quietude deepened. The easy laughter that had once filled their home grew less frequent, replaced by long stretches of contemplative silence. During dinner, Sarah would find his gaze had become distant, his mind clearly miles away. Lost in a troubled landscape she could not see or navigate. She tried to breach the silence once, placing a hand on his, as they sat on the porch one evening. "Is everything okay at work, David?" she had asked, her voice gentle. He had flinched, just for a second, before his composure returned. He squeezed her hand, smiled a tired but reassuring smile, and spoke of budget cuts and new regulations. It was a plausible, logical explanation, and she had accepted it. Because the alternative that the man she shared her life with was keeping a secret from her, a secret so heavy it was physically changing him, was simply unthinkable. She didn't know that his deception was an act of love, an attempt to build a firewall between his family and the darkness he had uncovered. He was a soldier again, fighting a silent, lonely war, and the enemy was far closer than she could ever have conceived. On that final, sun-drenched morning, as he leaned in to kiss her goodbye before his run, his familiar scent of soap and coffee filling her senses, she had no idea it was the last time. She didn't see the shadow of that secret war lingering behind his eyes. She only saw the man she loved, the man who was the unwavering center of her world. Before he turned and jogged down the driveway, vanishing into the beautiful, terrible, and fatally indifferent woods, the simple, Round-faced clock on the kitchen wall continued its indifferent march. Each tick was a small, sharp hammer blow against the thickening silence in the house. 9:47 a.m. The time was no longer a measure of the morning. It had become an epitaph for it, a demarcation point between a life that was known and an abyss that was not. A man like David Witmore did not break routine. An hour-long run meant precisely 1 hour, not 2. Sarah's coffee sat untouched, a skin forming over its cold, black surface. The joyful sounds from the backyard had long since faded. Emma, sensing the profound shift in the home's emotional climate, had come inside, her playful energy extinguished, replaced by a child's solemn, watchful gaze. With a tremor in her hand she could not control, Sarah picked up the phone for the third time. The act of dialing felt foreign, heavy. The line connected. One ring echoed in the receiver, a hollow question sent into an empty void. 2 rings. She pictured the trail, not with sunlight now, but with deepening shadows. A twisted ankle, a plausible, desperate explanation. 3 rings. The image darkened further afall. A sudden medical crisis. A stranger emerging from the trees. 4. Then, the click. His voice, so calm and measured, filled her ear. "You've reached David Witmore. Leave a message." The familiar recording, once a mundane part of their lives, had become a spectral artifact. It was the voice of a man who was already a memory, preserved on a magnetic tape. The sterile, electronic beep that followed seemed to stretch into eternity, an abyss of sound that consumed what little hope she had left. She hung up without a word. What could she possibly say to a ghost? "Is something wrong with Daddy?" Emma's small voice sliced through the tension. Children possess an almost supernatural barometer for adult fear. And she had read the terror on her mother's face with perfect, heartbreaking clarity. Those wide blue eyes, David's eyes, searched her mother's for an assurance she could not possibly give. "I'm sure he's fine, sweetheart." Sarah lied, the words tasting like ash, and he probably just lost track of time. But the lie was flimsy, transparent even to herself. By noon, the fragile shell of denial had been pulverized, with a deep, shuddering breath that felt like surrendering. Sarah dialed the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department, and in doing so, invited the cold, impersonal machinery of the outside world into her private hell. The arrival of Deputy Maria Martinez's patrol car marked the moment a family's fear became a community's case file. Her manner was gentle, her voice soft, but her questions were a series of precise, necessary scalpels, dissecting the life Sarah had built. Each query about their finances, about David's moods, about the fidelity of their marriage felt like an insinuation, a suggestion that the fault lay not in the shadows of the forest, but within the walls of their own home. Sarah found herself defending her husband, her marriage, her entire existence to a stranger, taking notes in a small leather book, each scratch of the pen documenting the formal unraveling of her world. "Sometimes people have reasons we don't see," the deputy offered, her kindness making the words cut even deeper. "Sometimes they're protecting the ones they love." The statement hung in the air, a sinister seed of doubt planted in the fresh, raw wound of Sarah's uncertainty. What began as a flicker of concern had by late afternoon erupted into a full-blown conflagration, a wave of communal support, genuine and pure-hearted, crested and broke upon the Whitmore property. Volunteers in bright orange vests formed a civilian army against the encroaching dusk, their flashlights cutting feeble beams into the vast, darkening woods. the air filled with the crackle of walkie-talkies and the sounds of David's name being called out, only to be swallowed by the indifferent trees. Emma, refusing to be left behind, stood at the edge of the forest, her small face a mask of fierce determination. She demonstrated the piercing, two-fingered whistle her father had taught her, sending the call high and clear into the woods. The sound echoed once, twice, then died, unanswered. The unwavering confidence in her small act of faith was the most heartbreaking sight of all. As night fell, the search parties returned, one by one, their shoulders slumped, their faces etched with failure. The forest had stonewalled them. It had yielded nothing, not a footprint out of place, not a single thread of torn clothing, not a glint of metal from a dropped house key. It was a perfect, impossible absence of evidence. In the weeks that followed, the search evolved. The human element of volunteers and neighbors was replaced by the cold technology of the state. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation deployed teams with sophisticated equipment. They brought cadaver dogs, whose keen noses were meant to detect the chemistry of death. But the dogs swept through the woods and found only the scent of pine needles and damp earth. They brought ground-penetrating radar, a machine designed to see beneath the surface of the world. But the screen showed only roots and rock. The grim, methodical grid searches turned up nothing. It was as if David Witmore had not been a man of flesh and blood, but a phantom who had simply dissolved. With the utter failure of evidence, a vacuum was created, and into that void, the darker side of the community's nature began to seep. The casseroles stopped arriving. The sympathetic phone calls dwindled. The initial tide of support receded, leaving behind the ugly sediment of speculation. The whispers started in the town diner, over coffee cups and plates of pie. He was having an affair. They spread to the post office. He was in debt up to his eyes. They echoed in the pews after Sunday service. He finally cracked under the pressure. Sarah could feel the shift. She saw it in the eyes of other mothers at the school pickup, a flicker of pity mixed with suspicion. She heard it in the sudden silence that fell when she walked down an aisle at the grocery store. Her family's tragedy was becoming the town's sordid entertainment. She was no longer just a grieving wife. She was a possible accomplice, a possible fool, the woman who had been left behind. Her daughter suffered a different, quieter agony. The 8-year-old who had whistled for her father had stopped asking when he was coming home. Instead, she began a silent, heartbreaking vigil, standing at the living room window for hours, her gaze fixed on the empty driveway. Through the changing seasons, she watched as autumn leaves fell, as winter frost coated the glass, as spring brought new life to a world where hers had been suspended. Her bright, incandescent spirit was slowly, inexorably dimming, like a star collapsing into itself. Sheriff Patricia Coleman, a tough, experienced officer, found herself confronting the most frustrating case of her career. During one of her final visits, she laid a series of stark, clinical photographs on Sarah's kitchen table. They showed the trail from every conceivable angle. It's like he just stepped off the path and vanished into thin air. The sheriff confessed, the words an admission of utter defeat. There is nothing here. It's the most perfect disappearance I have ever seen. The case grew cold, frozen in a state of absolute mystery. The file remained open, a bureaucratic formality. But the active search was suspended. The forest had won. The silence was complete. And it would last for a generation. The years passed. not as a gentle stream, but as a slow, grinding glacier, eroding hope and leaving behind a scarred landscape of memory. The world outside the Whitmore house spun on. A new century dawned. Technology reshaped society. Millbrook County itself began to change, the suburbs of Atlanta creeping ever closer. But inside the house, on the edge of the woods, time remained fractured, forever tethered to the morning of October 15th, 1998. Emma grew up, left for college, became a pediatric nurse, a career dedicated to saving others, perhaps to subconsciously atone for the father she could not save. Sarah remained. The house became her anchor and a prison, a sanctuary of memories too precious to abandon and a constant, agonizing reminder of her loss. She became the stoic guardian of a story that had no ending. Then came the phone call. It happened on a rainy Tuesday morning in March of 2025. 27 years, an entire lifetime had passed since the day her world had ended. Sarah, now a grandmother in her late 60s, was in her kitchen, the morning ritual of making coffee a familiar comfort in a life defined by absence. The phone rang. Its modern, digital chime, a stark contrast to the old rotary phone she'd had in 1998. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and belonged to a detective, Angela Reyes, with the GBI's reactivated cold case unit. "Mrs. Whitmore?" the detective began, her tone gentle, but freighted with a significance that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand up. "I'm calling about your husband, David Witmore." Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, the one David used to sit in, her hand gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned a bloodless white. "We found something," Detective Reyes continued, and with her next words, the glacier of time that had entombed Sarah's life for 27 years finally, violently shattered. A safe was discovered 2 days ago in the Okefenokee swamp. "We have reason to believe it is connected to your husband's disappearance." Hope. It was a brutal, savage sensation after so long without it. It surged through her, a painful electric current, and with it came an equal, sickening wave of dread. The truth, the thing she had prayed for, bargained for, and eventually learned to live without, might finally surface. But what horrors would it drag up from the mud? With it, she made 2 calls, her fingers trembling. The first was to Emma, now a 35-year-old mother of 2. Emma listened in stunned, breathless silence, the professional calm of the nurse she had become dissolving to reveal the frightened child still inside. She promised to drive up from Savannah that evening. That night, mother and daughter sat together in the living room where they had once waited for David to come home from his run. The years fell away. In the soft lamplight, they were once again the 2 people he had left behind. "I used to dream about this," Emma admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "That someday we'd find out. But now that it might actually happen, I'm so scared." "So am I," Sarah confessed, her hand finding her daughter's. "But we'll face it together, just like we have faced everything else." Outside, the rain had stopped. The familiar sounds of the Georgian night, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl filled the air. But tonight, they felt different. They were not menacing, not anymore. They felt expectant. It was as if the very landscape, the silent forest and to the dark water, was holding its breath, finally ready to speak after 27 years of keeping its terrible secret. The drive to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's field office in Macon was a silent pilgrimage through time. The landscape that scrolled past the car windows was a testament to 27 years of change. New subdivisions with unfamiliar names sprawled where dense forests had once stood. and gleaming shopping centers occupied land that had been quiet, unassuming farmland when David disappeared. For Sarah and Emma, the journey was a profound unspoken acknowledgement of their own altered lives, a world that had relentlessly moved on, while a part of them had remained forever frozen on an autumn morning in 1998. The GBI facility was a modern, imposing structure of glass and steel. It was a place of hard facts and empirical science, a world away from the murky, suffocating mystery they had inhabited for so long. Detective Angela Reyes met them in the lobby. Her presence was one of quiet competence, her eyes conveying a depth of empathy that belied the grim nature of her profession. She led them not to a sterile interview room, but to an elevator that descended into the building's secure heart. "Before we enter," Detective Reyes said, her voice steady and deliberate, "I need to prepare you. The safe is in extremely poor condition. The corrosion is extensive." The forensics laboratory was a shock of bright, sterile light filled with the low, electronic hum of equipment designed to coax secrets from the inanimate. And there, in the center of the room, sitting on a large metal examination table, was the object of their journey. It was larger than Sarah had imagined, a formidable sentinel of rusted steel that had kept its vigil in the Blackwater for nearly 3 decades. The mud and decay that clung to its surface could not obscure the crude, violent carving that had summoned them here. DW, 10/15/98. Emma let out a small, choked gasp, her hand instinctively finding her mother's. This was it, the sole, silent witness to her father's final day on earth. "Take all the time you need," Detective Reyes said softly, guiding a trembling Sarah to a nearby chair. A technician in a white lab coat approached the table, his movements precise. His tool, a high-powered plasma cutter. "The hinges are fused," he announced to the room. "We have to cut through the door." The process was an eternity of controlled destruction. The laboratory filled with the high-pitched, metallic scream of the cutter and the acrid smell of burning steel. Brilliant. Incandescent sparks flew in fiery arcs, a violent baptism of light for an object that had known only darkness. It was as if the safe was finally exhaling 27 years of secrets in a shower of golden fire. And then, with a final, jarring thud, the severed door fell away. The scream of the machine was replaced by an absolute, profound silence. Detective Reyes and the technician approached the gaping black opening, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness within. From their vantage point, Sarah and Emma could see nothing but the investigators' faces. And what they saw was not the grim discovery of human remains they had braced for. It was something else entirely. Surprise, disbelief, utter confusion. "Mrs. Witmore," Detective Reyes said, her voice imbued with a strange new tone of awe. "You need to see this." They approached the table, hand in hand. The safe was not a tomb. It did not contain the decay of a body, but the perfect preservation of a life's lost. Secret work. Carefully arranged inside were stacks of waterproof containers. Each was meticulously sealed and labeled with dates. Inside them, perfectly preserved from the swamp's corrosive touch, were notebooks, microcassette tapes, a digital camera, and what appeared to be surveillance equipment. The technician handed a notebook to Detective Reyes. She opened it to a random page, filled with precise, disciplined handwriting. Sarah saw it, and a jolt went through her heart. So powerful, it nearly buckled her knees. She didn't need to be told. She knew that handwriting better than her own. It was David's. The sterile lab was exchanged for a secure conference room, a space that would become the epicenter of the Witmore family's new world. Investigators, with a reverence typically reserved for archaeological treasures, laid out the contents of David's secret archive. It was the last will and testament of a man who knew he was running out of time. The notebooks were a revelation, filled with meticulous observations, license plate numbers, and hand-drawn maps that documented a criminal conspiracy with chilling precision. "What was he doing?" Emma whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the silent room. A technician carefully placed a small cassette tape into a player. The tape was labeled Octet 12 1998, MRJC Delivery. The room was silent except for the soft hiss of old magnetic tape. Then, the voices emerged from the speaker. They were clear, casual, and utterly monstrous. They spoke of logistics, of shipments, of laundering money. And then they spoke of eliminating problems. For the first time in 27 years, Sarah and Emma were hearing the voices of the men who had stolen their world. As the tapes were transcribed and the notebooks deciphered, the full, horrifying truth was unveiled. David had stumbled upon, and then systematically documented, a sophisticated drug trafficking network. The key was found in a journal entry from 6 months before he vanished. Saw Emma at the water treatment plant after hours again. His truck was parked by the chemical storage building at 11 p.m. Something is wrong. Marcus Riley, a maintenance supervisor at the very same facility where David worked. A man whose name was familiar. A man David had likely shared coffee with. The evil that had taken him was not a stranger in the woods. It was a colleague, a neighbor. David's methodical notes revealed that Riley was using the plant as a processing lab for cocaine, and that his network included truck drivers, businessmen, and, most damningly, corrupt officials within local law enforcement. David Witmore hadn't just stumbled upon a crime. He had uncovered a cancer that had metastasized deep within his own community. He was not a random victim. He was a lone, clandestine investigator who had gotten too close to the sun. This revelation changed everything. The case was no longer a local tragedy. It was a federal crime scene. The GBI immediately looped in the FBI. The cold case file, once labeled missing person, was now the foundation of a multi-agency task force investigating homicide and organized crime. "Your husband was a hero," Mrs. Witmore, a senior FBI agent, told Sarah, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "The quality of this evidence, it's the kind of case agents dream of. He did our job for us." The justice system, dormant for so long, awoke with a vengeance. The dominoes, which had stood frozen for nearly 3 decades, began to fall with stunning speed. Pre-dawn raids were executed across 3 states. James Crawford, the trucker from the audio tapes, was arrested at his home in Valdosta, his face a mask of disbelief. A former Millbrook County Sheriff's deputy, now retired and living a quiet life in Florida, was led from his manicured lawn in handcuffs. The respectable facade of Millbrook County was systematically torn down, revealing the rot that had festered beneath for a generation. During a lengthy interrogation, facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence from David's own hand, Crawford began to talk. He confirmed everything David had documented. He described the growing paranoia of Marcus Riley, who had died of cancer in 2003, cheating the justice system as he realized someone at the plant was watching him. Crawford didn't confess to the murder itself, but he delivered the final chilling epitaph. He spoke of Riley's decision to take care of the problem for good. Riley always said, Crawford stated, his voice captured on a digital recording for posterity. That down here, some problems, some people, they just get lost in the swamp, where nobody ever finds them. The words brought the entire horrific story full circle, connecting the conspiracy back to the rusted safe and the dark, silent water that had been both a tomb for a man and a cradle for the truth. The arrests triggered a national media firestorm, a spectacle of headlines and 24-hour news cycles that descended upon the quiet community of Millbrook County. But for Sarah and Emma Witmore, the true storm was a silent, internal one, raging within the sanctuary of their own minds. For 27 years, they had been held captive by a single agonizing question: what happened now? They were confronted with a truth so vast and morally complex, it threatened to eclipse the simple, loving memory of the man they had cherished. The discovery of the safe did not bring the simple piece of closure. It initiated a painful, necessary, and profound redefinition of a life, a marriage, a fatherhood, and a legacy. They had the answers. But the answers forced them to grapple with a new, more difficult set of questions about the nature of love, secrets, and sacrifice. The David they had known, the man of meticulous habits, gentle humor, and unwavering devotion, had been, in their memory, honest to a fault. Yet, they now possessed an entire archive proving he had maintained a secret life of incredible, isolating danger, all while preserving the delicate facade of a perfectly normal family existence. In the long, sleepless nights that followed the revelation, Sarah found herself wandering the familiar halls of her home, which now felt like the territory of a stranger. She would stand in the doorway of his old office, tracing the outlines of the books on his shelves. She would pick up a framed photograph from the mantelpiece of family vacation to the coast, all three of them smiling, the sun in their eyes. She would stare at David's smiling face and ask the silent image, "Were you happy then, or were you pretending?" The joy captured in that photograph, once a source of comfort, was now tainted with the shadow of his secret. She had to perform a kind of psychological surgery on her own past, painstakingly re-examining every memory, every shared laugh, every quiet moment, searching for the signs she had missed. The truth was, the signs were there, but they were written in a language of anxiety she had not been equipped to read. His quietude wasn't peace, it was the weight of his burden. His insistence on the new security system wasn't prudence, it was fear. Emma, as a pediatric nurse, was professionally trained to observe, diagnose, and heal. She dealt with trauma and grief on a daily basis, armed with clinical language and a compassionate but professional distance. Now she was forced to turn that analytical lens upon her own life. Her own father, she understood, with a painful, academic clarity, the moral imperative that had driven him. She recognized the pathology of the criminal network he sought to expose. But the daughter in her, the 8-year-old girl still waiting by the window, could not entirely silence a profound sense of anger. It was an anger born not of betrayal, but of a deep, protective love. "Why didn't you tell us she would ask the photograph on a dresser? Why didn't you trust us enough to let us be brave with you?" She was angry that he had carried the weight alone, that he had denied them the dignity of sharing his struggle. David's own notes, however, provided the chilling answer. His references to corruption within local law enforcement made his isolation clear. He had likely felt that telling his family would not just endanger them, but would make them accomplices in his dangerous quest. A burden he was unwilling to force upon them. His deception. They began to understand through long, tearful conversations was not a lack of trust. It was his final, most desperate shield. The man who read bedtime stories and the man who documented felony drug crimes were not two different people. They were one and the same, and all his actions, both secret and known, were motivated by a single, powerful, and ultimately fatal force: the ferocious need to protect the people he loved. The criminal trials began 18 months after the discovery of the safe. They were a somber, methodical affair. The grinding of the wheels of a justice system awakened after a long and unforgivable slumber. The courtroom was a theater of ghosts. The defendants, now aging and infirm men, were specters from a previous era. Their once intimidating power withered by time and ill health. They were brought to account by the ghost they themselves had created. David Witmore, though absent in body, was the undeniable center of the proceedings. His clear, steady voice, captured on crackling audio tapes, echoed to the silent courtroom. His meticulous, damning notes, displayed on large screens for the jury to see, testified from beyond the grave. The convictions came, one by one, a slow, satisfying dismantling of a legacy of crime, but the most profound moment of justice, the moment that truly began the healing process for Sarah and Emma, came not from a judge's gavel, but from a confession of the soul. During his sentencing hearing, a middle-aged Marcus Riley Jr., the son of the conspiracy's dead mastermind, a man who had lived his entire adult life under the shadow of his father's sins, turned to face Sarah and Emma in the gallery. His voice, heavy with a lifetime of inherited guilt, was clear and did not waver. "I'm sorry for what happened to Mr. Witmore," he said, the words a stunning admission that silenced the courtroom. "He was trying to do the right thing. And my father was a man ruled by fear of losing everything. It doesn't excuse what happened, but I wanted you to know that your husband died for something that mattered. It was not an apology that could mend a wound 27 years deep, but it was something more valuable. It was an acknowledgement, a final, human validation that David's sacrifice had not been in vain." In the quiet aftermath of the trials, as the media moved on to the next tragedy, Sarah made a decision. It was time to leave the house. The home that had been both a sanctuary and a prison for nearly 3 decades could finally be released. It was no longer a place of haunting uncertainty. It was now simply a house filled with the memories of a life fully understood. As she and Emma sorted through the last of David's belongings, they came across the archive that had changed everything. The evidence, having served its purpose, felt sacred. "These belong to the County Historical Society," Sarah said, her voice clear and resolved. "Let them be a lesson. Let people know that ordinary people are sometimes called upon to do extraordinary things, even when the cost is unbearable." One final, haunting secret, however, remained, despite renewed, technologically advanced searches based on the precise information from David's notes. The vast, impenetrable wilderness of the Okefenokee Swamp never surrendered his body. It kept its final charge, a silent, eternal guardian. And Sarah, to her own surprise, found that she was at peace with this. David's true memorial was not a plot of earth marked by a cold stone. It was the prison sentences of the men who had killed him. It was the dismantling of the evil he died to expose. It was the truth, finally, irrevocably, brought into the light. Sarah moved to a small, sun-drenched house with a garden in Savannah, just a short drive from Emma and her grandchildren. The air there, thick with the scent of salt water and magnolias, was a world away from the Georgia pine and the constant, silent presence of the woods that had taken him. The change of scenery was a final act of liberation, allowing her to untangle the memory of her husband from the geography of his loss. She could now remember their boundless love without the ever-present, painful reminder of his absence. Her grandchildren, with their bright, curious eyes, knew stories of the grandfather they had never met. They knew he was a hero who read stories with funny voices and who had helped catch very bad people. And for them, for the future he had died to protect. That was enough. In the end, the great mystery that had consumed a family and a community for a generation had found its resolution. It was not the ending they had ever imagined, but it was the one that was true. The resolution was not in the return of the man they had lost, but in the profound, immutable understanding of why he was gone. On the anniversary of his disappearance, a simple memorial bench in the Millbrook Town Square often bears fresh flowers. The bronze plaque, weathered by the Georgia sun and rain, does not tell the whole complex story of a secret war fought by a solitary man. It reads simply, David Witmore, 1959 to 1998. He died protecting his community. It is a quiet tribute to a quiet man. A testament to the fact that the greatest heroism is often found not in the roar of battle, but in the silent, solitary, and unwavering refusal to look away from evil. David Witmore had finally come home, not in body, but in truth. And that truth, born of a love strong enough to reach across the decades, had been worth the long, silent, heartbreaking wait.